QuickBooks Online 2025, the Customer Center, which might also be called the Accounts Receivable Center, the Sales Center, the Income Center, or possibly the Revenue Center. Get ready and some coffee because we're learning how to save time with QuickBooks Online 2025. Here we are online in our browser searching for that QuickBooks Online test drive, the free sample company file available to everybody, looking for the result that has Intuit.com in the URL because Intuit is the owner of QuickBooks. You might have to verify that you're not a robot, which you would want to do unless, of course, you are actually a robot. In that case, you'd have to basically lie in order to use the free sample company file. And I'm not going to tell you what to do in that case. You got to make your own judgment and moral call there. But in any case, once we're in here, we're in the sample company, Craig's Design and Landscaping Services, going into the reports like we do every time. And we're within the favorites. Right-click it on that balance sheet so we can open a link in a new tab. Right-click the profit and loss, open a link in the new tab. Let's tab to the middle. Close the hamburger. We want to do a range change for the 2 years, 01/01/24, tab 12/31/25. Notice that tab button and not entering the dashes is the easiest way to do the data input. If I select the drop down here, I'm going to look at it by year and then run it to refresh it, 2024, 2025, side by side. Let's go to the tab to the right, same process. Close up that hamburger. If you want to eat the hamburger, you got to put the top bun on it or else you get ketchup on your fingers. Everybody knows that. Close the hamburger. 01/01/24 tab 12/31/25. We're going to select the drop down years, run it to refresh it. Nothing's in 2025 at this time except for that $34, including prior transactions we entered in prior presentations because we refreshed the browser, opening it this time in incognito window. If you want to follow along and have the numbers more likely the same, you might want to do the same. Let's go over to the first tab. We'll hit the plus button. You will recall we've been thinking about the cycles within the cycles within the cycles. Prior section, we looked at the vendor cycle, ultimately money going out in the vendor cycle. This time we're looking at the customer cycle, ultimately money coming in for goods and services that we provide to our customers. We looked at a flow chart last time, thinking about the easiest kind of cycle that we can use, possibly integrating the bank feeds, possibly using the deposit form from the bank feeds to record the revenue side of things, up to the more complex system, typically a more complex system including accrual components. And the most common accrual components to add complexity is tracking accounts receivable. That means that when we make a sale, it's not going to be at a cash register possibly, but rather we're going to have to do the work first, invoice the client. And in that case, we send out the physical invoice and then we're going to have to collect on it, which is always difficult because there's a lot of deadbeats out there that aren't going to pay you. So you might want to think about who we're doing business with first of all, so we don't have to spend all our time to kind of collect the money from the deadbeats or sell our receivables to collection companies or something just so we can get paid for the work we did. Anyways, I don't mean to got a little excited there. I'm sorry. But the idea is that then we might have to track. So where do we go to track the receivables? We go into the customer center, or you might call it the sales center. Now, if you don't have receivables, if you're at a food truck or you're selling things at the point in time that they happen, then you probably don't spend a lot of time in the customer center unless there's returned merchandise or something like that. So if you are dealing with receivables, especially if you're in a larger business, you might specialize just in the receivables, spending all your time in the customer center. So it's over here on the sales tab. So if we go into the sales tab, I'm going to close up the ham boogie. Up top, we've got the overview. We've got the all sales. We've got the invoices, estimates, sales order, recurring payments, and then this is the main one. We would be looking at the customers and then the products and the services. So the customers, of course, are who we sell things to, noting that if you're at like a cash register or something like that, you might not even be getting the names of the customers. You might, if you're entering them into QuickBooks as a sales receipt, just record them as generic customer at the cash register customer, and then you just make your sales and you're not really tracking the customer information. If you sell stuff on a Shopify store or something like that, you might be tracking the customer information in the Shopify store or at the Amazon web location. And when you import the information into QuickBooks, maybe you're not pulling in all the customer information because it would be overwhelming in those cases, and you already have it possibly elsewhere sometimes. However, if you're invoicing clients with a service type of business or selling from the QuickBooks itself, then you're going to be tracking the customers. And in particular, when you have to do that invoicing process, because then you're going to have these outstanding items that we need to be tracking. All right, let's go through each of these tabs one by one, however. So we've got the overview. So although this is the first tab, it's probably not where you're going to spend most of your time. What we have up top is Get Paid Anywhere. So download the QuickBooks Go Payment app. So in other words, they're trying to set up a process to allow you to pay more easily, possibly through the phone, noting that in order to do that, you might have to set up like a bank account basically through QuickBooks, remembering that that's a little bit different than the bank feeds. In other words, when we think about the bank feeds, what happens is we have a third-party bank and we're connecting QuickBooks to the third-party bank, but the bank isn't actually run by QuickBooks or Intuit, the owner of QuickBooks. We're just importing the data from the third-party bank into our system. However, if we would like to basically, for example, send invoices and have them automatically click on the invoice and be able to pay the invoice, then we're going to need some kind of system to do that. And you might have more functionality if you have, say, like a QuickBooks basically banking or institution, which might be one way to do that. Another way is to get paid basically by credit cards or by a third-party app like a PayPal or something like that. But if you have the automatic transaction, you got to watch out for fees. So those are things basically that you can keep in mind in terms of how you might be able to automate or make more easy your payment. So you can look into those items. I think we have another course or section on those. We have the quick actions. So most of these you can find elsewhere, but you might be able to get them a little bit faster here. Overview of the invoices. Again, we're probably going to find this in a different tab, but they give you the overview in the overview. The tasks remind customers about 10 unpaid invoices. This is the thing that might be somewhat useful, I think, in this overview section. If you had these reminders, could give you some information here. Match or categories 33 sales transactions, and then you've got some of your charts. Then we have the All Sales tab. So when we look at the sales, I'm going to go to the plus button, which is now located over here because I have this hidden, or the hamburger is closed. So if I hit the plus button, remember all of these basically forms are under the what I would call the sales center or the customer center. So we have the customer here, over here, we're in the sales tab, customer center, sales center, revenue center. And so that means that here we've got most of those forms that you can basically sort by in a similar way as when we looked at the vendor side or the expenses center or expenses tab. We had the expenses tab up top, which gave us basically an ability to sort by forms under this category. So now we have the capacity under the sales tab to sort by forms that are under the customer center. So we have all transactions, so we can look at all transactions and sort them. Most likely the main form that we're going to look at is the invoices, because that means that we invoice the client, accounts receivable went up, and if it's unpaid, we're going to look for those unpaid invoices. However, they give us a whole nother tab to do that. This tab over here is designed specifically to sort the invoices. So it's a little bit redundant. That's probably where we would go. Notice if I look at the invoices, it adds up to 10,134. If I go into the balance sheet and look at accounts receivable, it's only at the 5,281. So I think this is including both invoices that are closed and not closed. Here's the status. So I hit the status. If I go to open invoices, now we're at 5,851.52. That should tie out to what's on the balance sheet, which is 5,281. 5,281? 5,851. They got those numbers backwards. They're messing with me, man. They're messing with my backwards head. So, any case, it should tie out. Generally, we'll take a look at the subledger, and it will tie out basically generally exactly. But there is that, so we can search by the open items there, and then and by delivery method, send later or print later, okay? And so let's go to the next one, estimates. Now, estimates, if I look at the flow chart over here, this is a desktop flow chart, but just to get an idea of the flow here, if we have to invoice somebody, we might first do an estimate, but you wouldn't always do an estimate. An estimate is similar to a purchase order in that it doesn't actually record something, but if someone calls in and they're saying, how much will this cost if I buy this particular product or if I do this landscaping project? You can then make the estimate, which looks like an invoice, but doesn't actually record it. And then if they actually want to follow through with it, you can take that estimate and create the invoice from the estimate. So that means that from the estimate side of things, we would like to know the status of the estimates. And typically we have, the pending, accepted, open, or closed estimates that might be the different tags that we put on the estimate so that we can then sort them and see whether or not we want to follow up on the estimate to see if that particular client would like to follow through with the estimate. You would only be using estimates in particular types of businesses, most likely like a custom project, job cost type of system oftentimes. But also note, again, you have another estimates tab over here. So it's a little bit redundant that we have the estimates in this one because we can also find them elsewhere. And then we've got the other forms in there, like the change orders, the credit memos. So a credit memo we'll talk more about later, but if they were to return the merchandise or something like that, we might have to issue a credit memo so we can sort by the credit memo. The sales receipts, now this would be the ones where we sell something at a cash register. And so most likely here, we wouldn't normally need to sort for them. But if someone had like a return or something like that, we might find that here. But again, more likely we'd probably go into the customer in that situation. Unbilled income. So now these would be things like when we use the billable items, such as with the expense form and check forms that we talked about before, or we enter billable time, then it means that we've recorded the time, but we haven't actually sent out an invoice for it. So we could have a list here. That is one of the more useful items here because this would be quite useful if we have a job cost system, for example, billing out the time of people that work for us, and then we want to look at the time so we can make them monthly bills or something like that, which we'll talk more about in the second half of the course. Money received. So we have the payments then, payment forms, and the sales receipts. So this would be basically the money in forms. Notice what's not in here typically is the deposit. So we talked about last time when we think about our cycle, the easiest cycle we said was like gig work, in which case you just wait till it clears the bank and record the income with a deposit form. Because that form isn't the normal sales form, you're going to lose some tracking because notice that that's not usually included here. Included here are the forms where the money is coming in from the sales forms, which are usually invoices and sales receipts. Now, again, if you have gig work, it would be easy to use the deposit form, and losing a little bit more of that kind of information might be worthwhile to have the simplicity of just using the bank feeds to record everything. And so then we've got the recently paid items, so that we've got paid on recently. All right, so those are those. If we go to the invoices, now this is the one that we're going to possibly spend the most time in because we're trying to collect on the invoices in those types of businesses where we have to track accounts receivable. So you would only be in here for like a landscaper or law firm or something like that, not for a food truck or something, because you wouldn't have any receivables for the food truck. So here we have the more simplified sorting. We have the overdue items, not due yet items, and then the not deposited. So that means that we've collected on it and haven't deposited, and then the items deposited. So these two over here are the overdue and not due yet. So oftentimes we might be looking at the overdue items and saying, hey, look, these are the people that have not paid us. So we would like to follow up on a payment with them, possibly sending out another invoice in order to try to collect on it. And at some time, if we can't get paid from them, Then we have to say, okay, do we want to try to sell this receivable to a collection agency or something like that? Or possibly say, we're not going to get paid by this person and give up, in which case we'd have to write it off at some future point. These ones are not yet paid, so we would typically want to say, okay, how often do we want to follow up on the payment? So if we sent out the invoice, when is the next time we want to follow up, maybe sending out a second invoice to try to get paid on it? This one, not yet deposited. What does that mean? Well, if I go over here, notice the flow chart, you've got the invoice, and then you receive the payment. When you receive the payment, you could use this form as a deposit form, as we'll see when we go through the forms, putting it directly into the checking account, but you oftentimes might put it into an undeposited fund or some type of clearing account, funds to be deposited, because if you're using an intermediary, like you're getting paid in cash and you need to group it together and put it into the bank, or you're getting paid through a credit card, or you're getting paid through an intermediary platform, Stripe, PayPal, or something like that, then they might group the payments together and put it in your bank account in a grouped format. And therefore, you're going to want to put it into some kind of clearing account and then make the deposit that ties out to the payment that you received and deal with any kind of fees at that time as well. So these ones then are saying that we have them, but they're most likely in the clearing account, right? So if I added these payments up, you would think that might tie out then if I go into this undeposited items. So we've collected on them, but they're in this account, which is basically a kind of cash account, but it's not up here in the cash area, but rather in other current assets, because doesn't have the subledger of cash, and it's going to be transferred from here into here when we make the deposit into the bank. And then these are the ones that have been deposited. So once we deposit them, they'll move from here over to the deposited area. Now, we also have the status here. So once again, you can do it this way. All items. We've got needs attention items. And then we've got unpaid. So this one gives you both of these that are unpaid, right? And then we have overdue and not due, which is the breakout between these two we saw up top. And then the paid items. So these are all the paid items. And then we have the breakout between not deposited, which was this one, and deposited. We can create an invoice from here. We can import from here. And there we have it, our actions. So we can change the balance due and the due date so that we can see that information up top. And once we receive the payment, we can receive the payment. We'll take a look at that later. And we have the ability to duplicate. We can send again, share invoice, print, void, delete, and so on and so forth. All right, let's go to the estimate tab up top. So now this would only be in a case where you're going to have an estimate saying, someone's going to say, how long will a job take? Or how much will this guitar cost? If I buy this stuff, how much will it cost? We can say, okay, we're going to make an estimate, which will mirror the look of an invoice. And then if you want to follow through with the estimate, we will convert the estimate to the invoice. So that means this can help us sort the estimates where we see all of them, the pending expired estimates, the declined estimates, so they and then the accepted estimates, and then the closed estimates. So that'll help us to basically track the estimates so that when someone comes in, we can find the estimate possibly here, or we would often maybe go to the customer and find the estimate there. And then when we see the drop down, we can edit, we can duplicate, we can send the estimate, we can share the estimate, update, copy to a purchase order if we needed to purchase something from the estimate, delete, view activity. Now, if the estimate was open, then we would maybe be able to make an invoice from it, right? And then once we make the invoice, then it would close the estimate. All right. And then we've got the sales orders. So sales orders, this is dealing with the possibility of integrating with an online store like an eBay, an Amazon, and a Shopify. So they have a specialty kind of link that might help you with those areas. So if you're specializing within eBay, Amazon, and Shopify. I think we have another whole nother course or section on it, and you want to have an idea of exactly what to do there. It used to be that we would be integrating third-party applications to help with the integration between the sales that are happening on these platforms and in QuickBooks. Now, notice that if you sell on these platforms, you're dealing with inventory, you're possibly dealing with sales tax issues because of that, and you're dealing with customers, although possibly not accounts receivable, right? So the question will become, do I want to track all the customer information and the sales information and the inventory information on these platforms only, not pulling them into QuickBooks, but simply summarizing the data for the financial statements, which a lot of people will argue that might be the way to go, so that you don't overload QuickBooks with too much data that you don't need because it's duplicated because you already have it on the other platform? Or do you want to pull that information into QuickBooks so that you can navigate around QuickBooks more easily? So that's a specialty area. Again, we have another course or section on it. Our reoccurring payments get paid automatically with reoccurring payments. So get paid on one time, every time, by charging customers on a schedule. So in certain types of businesses, that might be an easier way to set things up. So again, you can kind of look into that. Sometimes when you look at making the payment system as seamless as possible, QuickBooks has an incentive to try to get you to sign up, not just to the bank feeds, which is a third party, but to kind of like their bank, right? Because then they can integrate a little bit more of the integration to try to schedule payments. So that might help you in some cases if you want to try to schedule the payments and have them pay you automatically certain ways. Otherwise, you might still be able to automate the payments so that they pay you automatically through an automatic payment through your bank, but then it'll come through the bank feeds, right? Which it won't be exactly integrated into QuickBooks. Or when you invoice somebody, then you might try to have a link on the invoice that you email that automatically allows them to pay from your bank instead of using a credit card, which might cost you more because of fees, but you'll have to possibly have Intuit's bank. Otherwise, you can try to have them pay a direct payment to your bank, but that'll be a little bit more complicated, or a PayPal or something like that. But that might be a little bit more difficult to integrate as you send out the email. So you can look into those different options for how to integrate basically the payments. And then we have the customers. So of course, the customers is where we would go if people had questions about something, they're returning merchandise, or we're tracking the accounts receivable, or possibly we're looking for those estimates. So we have, once again, the automatic filter bar. So estimates, notice we don't have any open estimates at this time, as all the estimates we looked at before were closed. We've got the unbilled income. So this would be things like time that we charged, that if we're in a job cost system, but we haven't billed it out yet. We'll talk more about that mainly in the second half of the course when we do our practice problem. Or we have billable items, such as we paid for gas or supplies that we want to then pull over into an invoice so that we can bill the client as part of their project on that, but we haven't done it yet. And then we've got the overdue invoices. So these are the customers that have the overdue invoices, as opposed to on the invoices side when we looked at all of the overdue invoices themselves. And then we have the send a reminder and receive payment. And so we could send these reminders, and this is another area that we might touch on later. I think we have another course or section on just how you might send the reminders, because notice that some of these this one has 2 overdue invoices. So do you want to send them as they have late payments on the invoices? Do you want to send them 2 invoices again? Or most likely we're going to want to send a reminder periodically telling everybody, if they're all overdue invoices, here's a summary of how much you owe us, for example. And so we could set that up. And then we have the open, so 20 open invoices and credits, and then the recently paid ones. Okay, and so then if we go down here and if we go into, let's go into overdue invoices. If we go into a particular client, then now we can see the actual client And we have our activity down here. So if they had a question, we can go down here and figure out what has happened. Notice it's beautifully laid out. And notice the only thing you're going to see here are invoices and payments if you have an invoice system. Otherwise, we would have the sales receipts, which would be the form used when you have at a cash register. Notice that deposits aren't typically something that's going to be in here. So if you sell stuff and you just record it with a deposit, again, you're not going to have all the detail as nicely laid out as if you use the form designed for sales, invoices, and sales receipts. However, that might be the easiest thing to do in some cases, like in gig work, and the trade-off would be worthwhile possibly. So notice we have a payment that's been closed out. You can see the invoice has been paid, and so on and so forth. And you can go in here and look for basically the open item. Here's basically the open item. So if we had a question, we're going to say, hey, here's the one that's open. You owe us this money, and so on and so forth. We'll talk more about that as we go through each of the forms. So then we have the transaction list as well. We've got the statements. We've got the recurring transactions, the customer detail, and the late fees. We're mostly going to be over here in this area. Note that when we set up a new customer, you can set up a new customer from here, but oftentimes you might be setting up a new customer as you record the sales form, whether that be an invoice or a sales receipt, right? So we're going to, as we make the invoice and bill the client, if it's a new customer, we're probably going to set up the invoice, set up the customer when we create the invoice possibly, which will then populate it over here. Also note, when I go back, I'm not going to use the arrow up here. I'm going to try to use the arrows that are designed within the website if we have them, which normally we do within QuickBooks. So this arrow takes me back to the customers here. All right, so we have a customer type, new customer up top. So we could make a new customer here if we wanted to make the new customer without having to do the to enter an invoice at the time we do it. Sorry for the stuttering there. Import customers and multiple customers, and then we've got the products and services. So this is where we are going to list the things that we actually sell. So meaning if they're inventory items, this is the list of the inventory items that we're going to have, and we're going to have to include the sales price as well as the cost if we're tracking them internally. We'll also have to apply out the sales tax, whether they're going to be subject to sales tax, which is a consumption tax within here, and service items, so that when we create an invoice, it should be as easy as possible. Now, this is where a lot of people get messed up because they don't properly list out their items. And what you want to do is make the data input for an invoice and a sales receipt as easy as possible. The items that you're selling should already be set up and you can just pick them. And that would be the easiest thing to do. And so, but some people, the other method is to use like a time method, meaning you're going to bill people based on hours, which is often the case for a law firm or for a CPA firm, possibly landscaping. But a lot of times, even in a service business, you'd like to maybe avoid that if you could. For example, with the bookkeeping, you might try to say, hey, look, I'm going to charge you based on how many transactions I have. So I can actually count the transactions, and then I have a solid number, and I can back up and show you the work I did, and I can bill you that way. Sometimes you can't do that because you don't know, like if you're a law firm and you take something on, or I'm going to talk to the IRS for somebody, I have no idea how long that could take because, all I can do is go by hours. But if you can set up something other than hours, I think I like that better, right? I would really think about that option and say, okay, how can I set up maybe a subscription model so that I can pay for services and this subscription covers you whether you use the services or not, or a billable model based on how many transactions happened, or with taxes, how many forms you're creating or something like that, so that you have something tangible other than just trying to track the clock all the time and so on. So we'll talk more about these items in future presentations. So that's the general setup for the sales. In future presentations, we're going to go into most of these forms and talk about when we would use them, how they would be applied, what's going to be recorded on the financial statements when we record them, and how possibly bank feeds can fit in to that system, as well as sales tax, where does that fall in, and inventory and so on.